Hello 99ers, I've got a big batch of homebrew to throw at you today. Since I've finally gotten around to reviewing some of the best TI-99 games we got in 2022. Those being the games from Inufuto, a Japanese developer who does cross-platform development for a huge mix of 8-bit era systems. And so, while I'll be looking at Inufuto's TI-99 titles here, keep in mind, if you're a fan of other early 80s systems, there's a good chance there are versions of these games for your system of choice too. With Inufuto being Japanese, Japanese computers are a natural focus when it comes to this library of games. But a whole slew of Western computers are covered too, including our dear TI-99 4A. Plus, the Japanese focus even has a side benefit for a lot of 99ers, since one system supported by most of these games is Impetus, which is a system of interest to TI-99 fans at large, since it's more or less a third-party rework of the TI-99-8, the unreleased sequel to the TI-99 4A. But I won't get into the Impetus today. That's a much bigger subject. It's just nice that, for present purposes, all of these are games you're not just able to play on the TI-99 4A, but on the Impetus too. Anyway, let's look at what we've got here, which is 11 games spanning a whole bunch of the most popular genres of the early 80s. And when we've looked at those, I'll tell you which are my top picks, and give you my ranking of the whole bunch, from best to worst. So, kicking things off, let's start with Ariel, which is a side-scrolling shooter where you fly a plane trying to shoot down enemies and trying not to get taken down by the flurry of bullets flying everywhere. As you can see, the game moves at a pretty leisurely pace. Though that having said, the screen gets busy enough in the later stages that you'll definitely have plenty of trouble on your hands. Enemies attack from both sides, bullets fly in all directions, and enemy airships even attack once in a while as a sort of a boss battle. The way the game uses lots of diagonal firing patterns here does the TI-99 some favors, since the 4 sprite per scan line limit is always going to be the main limit a TI-99 developer is up against in a game like this. And firing diagonally deals with that by making sure a line of bullets are all on different scan lines. Otherwise, as you can hear, the music is a major bonus in all these games. That upbeat music, playing seamlessly during gameplay, gives you plenty of reason to keep the sound on. So Ariel's a great little horizontal shooter for a TI-99 computer that doesn't have many of those. Partly because the sprite limit makes horizontal designs tricky, but I think also partly because, well, everyone played Parsec back in the day and said, I figure that's the final word, so we might as well not even try. As to that, I guess a certain Japanese developer never got the message that the TI crowd threw in the towel 40 years ago. Lucky for us, eh? But moving on, next up we've got Ascend. And this is a game that's a pretty conventional platformer, but what it does really, really well. You're climbing ladders to get where you need to go, which is the very top of the level, and to do that, you have to avoid or to trap the enemies in your way. Although it might not be obvious at first, you can actually jump over enemies and jump across gaps. It can just be better not to, since it's not particularly safe vis-a-vis just getting out of the way. Though it might be perfectly sensible to do it on the regular if you just got better at the game than I happen to be. This game does actually have one power-up in it, and that gives you temporary invincibility. That's via the green exclamation mark, which comes down the level sometimes exactly the same way an enemy would. It doesn't let you kill enemies, but it does let you ignore them, so that's a very handy tool. As the levels get higher, they get longer and tougher, and your routes get more complicated. And in later levels, the way to the final ladder usually isn't the most obvious one. So Ascend is a pretty traditional platformer. But what it doesn't have in innovation, it makes up for, I'd argue, by just being really well put together. Which brings me to the next game in this series, alphabetically anyways, Batlot. Batlot is more or less a top-down hallway shooter with destructible walls. You're on an even footing with your enemies since they're trying to shoot at you while you do the same. And ultimately, you're both trying to destroy the home base where both of you spawn. If you die in Batlot, you don't lose lives. You really just lose time. Since every time your Batlot dies, you start back at home base. And you're out of commission for a bit, while your enemies keep on making their own moves. That occasionally results in situations where you're just plain trapped, since the enemy will spawn camp you if it can, and in that case you will lose a life, because when the clock runs down to 0, you die. Batlot is a game that's all about positioning, where setting yourself up so that the enemy's gotta move into your line of fire is always the goal. And the indestructible gray tiles spread around the level are key to that, since they're your one guaranteed defense. Batlot's a pretty conservative design that's going to play well on a whole lot of different systems. And it plays pretty darn well on the TI-99, consequently. As does the next game on my list here, Bootscale, thanks to a pretty similar setup. Once the game starts, you can see there are destructible and indestructible tiles here, just like there were in Batlot. But in Bootscale, instead of shooting them, you're gonna shove them. Now if you do that to a block that's got another block behind it, it's just gonna destroy the block. But if you shove a block with space to move, instead, it'll move as far as it can. And ideally, it'll hit an enemy and take it out for you. The flip side of that is, enemies can shove blocks at you too. So another thing the game has in common with Batlot is that you and your enemies are on even terms. And it's really just a question of who shoots first. Or in this case, shoves first. But for all the dangers of blocks getting thrown at you, one thing you don't need to worry about, funnily enough, is enemies walking into you. Because the enemies in Bootscale never attack you head on. They just look for things to throw at you. That has kind of funny consequences if you let enemies get too numerous, since they'll mill around just being generally obnoxious, but never actually attacking you, as long as no blocks are on hand. Though you're never completely safe, since to stop a stalemate from happening, the game randomly spawns new blocks, just to make sure things always sort themselves out in the long run. So, clearly, designs like Batlot and Bootscale are not trying to reinvent the wheel. They're mostly familiar ideas, implemented well, often a bit differently than you might have seen before. It's keep it simple, stupid game software. And Cacorn at number 5 in this rundown is absolutely another example of that, with this game being a spin on the Snake games and Light Cycle games of the early 80s, where you lay down a line behind you as you move, but where, unlike in most Snake games, your goal isn't to run over each of the objects on the level, it's to surround them with the trail you're creating. And unlike in most Snake games, the trail you're creating isn't the danger here. Running into it will just collapse your trail and capture any stars inside it, which is a good thing as far as that goes. You just want to be strategic about it, because the best thing you can do score-wise is capture every star on a level in one loop, which means it's always tempting to go for that, no matter how unwise or unrealistic that might be. That all having said, just trying to do them all in one go usually won't work in later levels, where you really do need to be more careful, since there are just too many enemies to ignore. So use your trail as a defense against enemies, and capture stars in viable chunks, and make the most of the walls the level already contains. And being a little more careful in those ways, you can take on levels where enemies make things a little trickier. But moving on from top-down tile-based action to a different outlook on 80s gaming, next up we've got Cavit, which is, to be perfectly honest, a Dig Dug clone. No shame in that though, because as with so many of these, it's a good one. But why do we need another Dig Dug on the TI-99 when we already got one from Atari Soft in the system's heyday? Well, I think the answer to that is just the little things. For one thing, way better sound. Just listen to the original Dig Dug. And listen to Cavit. Not a dig at Dig Dug's original developers, though, since that was the sound of the era. At the time, almost nobody was implementing sample-based audio or attenuation envelopes or any of the fancy features that can make a PSG sound like a real instrument. But gameplay-wise, one thing you might notice is missing from Cavit's version of the Dig Dug design is an air pump. You can't kill enemies that way. You need to kill them by dropping a rock on them instead. Though, on the other hand, it has one gameplay element that Dig Dug doesn't, since the main objective here is treasure collection, not killing enemies, making it a mix of Boulder Dash and Dig Dug in that kind of way. So, Cavit is a well-made game, but it's also sort of one we already got back in the day. That is not a description that applies to the next game in this series, though, and that next game is Gunters. Now, the template for Gunters is plenty familiar to 80s gaming in general. It's a Galaga clone. But the exciting thing about that is, a Galaga clone, or a Galaxian clone for that matter, isn't something the TI-99 got in its heyday. So, like Ariel, which was the first game I looked at in this series, this is a game that I think would have wowed people a bit back in the TI-99's heyday. In the long run, we saw plenty of games that took vertical shooters to interesting places on the TI-99, but the early 80s didn't get those straight away. Data East developed Astro Fighter for TI-99 in '83, and that kind of did Galaxian things. But with TI's pullout, Astro Fighter never got a commercial release. And the same goes for Mission X, which likewise brought vertical shooter action to the TI-99, only for the release to get dropped. As far as Gunters goes, what sets it apart is just the number of fully animated enemies it puts on screen with not much flicker at all. And that seems to be thanks to a strategy of drawing them as background rather than sprites when they're not doing attack animations. So, there's some flicker, but not much. The only downside here is the game can bite off more than it can chew at times, and slow down as it tries to animate too many enemies. With the funny thing about that being, I probably wouldn't notice it so much if it weren't for the music, whose slowing pace is pretty hard to miss. Regardless, this is way closer to Galaga than we ever got in the TI-99's heyday, so it's hard to find reasons to complain about that. And it's easy to appreciate what Gunters adds to this list. But back to more familiar territory, we've next got another platformer, in Lyft. Though no complaints about that, since I like to ascend a whole lot. And Lyft lives up to the same high Inufuto standards. This is platforming as pure as it gets. You're on a set of platforms with elevators running between them, and you're facing off against enemies who will chase you wherever you go. Just one at first, so things start out easy enough. But more get added in later levels, and of course, things get trickier accordingly. The goal is to collect the flags as fast as you can for a time bonus. And you get a bonus for collecting the flashing flag when one's available, which can be tricky, since you can't run past a flag without collecting it, but it's usually possible. The level layouts aren't randomized in Lyft, they'll be the same every time you play, but there's no one solution to any level, so I don't feel like once you've beaten one, it's solved. Plus, it's viscerally satisfying enough as a platformer that you can almost play just for the joy of platforming itself. So there's a natural comparison to be made with Ascend, as I say, which was the second game I looked at here, where it's all about ladders instead of elevators, with 2 enemy types instead of 1, and some power-ups thrown in there too. That might make it sound like Lyft has not much going for it by comparison. But you could argue riding your path around the level ends up being more interesting in Lyft out of the two, just because the levels are more open and you've got a lot of items to collect there. Where in Ascend, it's all just about getting to the top. But now, with a couple solid platformers in this collection, it's time to move on to another popular 80s genre, maze games, with Maisie being the predictable name for the first one in Inufuto's library. And you can see on the title screen, Maisie's already setting itself apart a bit. It has a title screen design all its own, and even gives its characters some names, namely Man, Chaser, and Disturber, which is presumably a riff off Pac-Man's title sequence, as this is, after all, a maze game. Gameplay-wise, though, Maisie's not exactly like Pac-Man. It's more a maze-based hallway shooter. The catch being, you only have so many knives as you pick up on each level. So you've got to find a route that gets you the knives you need to kill the enemies you need to kill to get out. That action puzzler setup makes Maisie probably the game in this series it's easiest to feel like you've solved at some point, because there are only so many solutions to any given level, and once you've executed them, you can well and truly say it's beaten. Though you can always challenge yourself to do it faster. And Man, as the game calls him, does move really, really fast. So even once you know what to do, doing it blazingly fast is definitely a challenge, and one that might keep you busy for a while. If that style of maze game isn't up your alley though, you've got another option available in Inufuto's library, as the next game we're looking at here is a maze game too, and that is Neurus, which is an entirely different kind of puzzle. Where Maisie's a maze game with a hallway shooter twist that tests your reflexes, Neurus is a maze game with memorization mixed in to test your mind. The simple idea being, you're in a maze where cards are strewn around, and you've got to find and match up the cards, so that A and A are combined, and B and B are combined, and so on. So you can just run around throwing cards at each other until some of them match, and I have to admit that is definitely what I did at first. But the better thing to do would be to remember which cards you found where, and match them up with the same card. The challenge comes on two fronts, in that you've got to avoid enemies moving around the maze, or otherwise stun them by throwing your card at them, and you've got to complete the level as fast as you can, which, as I say, is mainly memorization. So that's all fine and dandy, and I think the memory game mechanic is done well for what it is. But for me, I think a game with more action and less remembering letters is probably more my speed. And I think I usually prefer a big open level to a maze. Which is why the final game of the 11 I'm looking at here, Riptus, really caught my interest. Riptus is a free-roaming space game on a playfield that wraps at the edges, so you can keep on flying in any direction as long as you like, though you'll eventually end up back where you started. Your job in Riptus is to destroy star bases spread across each level, and meanwhile, you've got red starfighters trying to make that harder for you, spawning just outside your vision. Then, on top of the starfighter, you've got laser shields that protect the star bases and make it harder to access parts of the map. But destroy them at their origin points, and you can get where you need to go. Riptus is a pretty easy game when you get a handle on it, but I'm kinda fine with that. For me, it's just a fun little opportunity to wander around a starfield, destroying everything in my path. I've always had a soft spot for more open, explorable worlds of the early 80s, so this is pretty up my alley. Gameplay is a little slower than I'd like it to be, but it's not what I'd consider a problem, and because the game doesn't add too many more enemies over time, it doesn't ever grind to a halt. So the upside with Riptus is it's an interesting and pretty unique space battle experience, while the downside is it's not really a challenge. It's the only game in this series I stopped playing when it was clear I'd just never die. Though in the end, I still enjoyed most of the ride. And I've enjoyed the ride playing all of Inufuto's TI-99 games to one extent or another. Though, at the start of all this, I promised I'd have a final ranking of the whole lot. So, let's look at all 11 games one more time, quickly, putting them in order from least worthwhile to most worthwhile to me. Starting at 11, where I've got Maisie, the maze game where you throw knives to kill your enemies to get to the exit. Not a bad game, because none of these are, but an action puzzler whose strategy was a bit limited for my tastes. Then at 10, Cacorn, the worm game where you capture stars by surrounding them while avoiding all your enemies. More interesting than your average worm game, but not by a ton. Next at 9, Neurus, the maze memory game where you combine cards and avoid enemies until you've found every match. Plays pretty well, but still, memorization mechanics don't do a lot for me. After that, at 8, it's Riptus, whose design really sold me as a free-roaming top-down space shooter, with the big downside just being a lack of challenge. It needs more difficulty curve to really shine. But at 7, Gunters gives us a space shooter that doesn't have that problem at all. It's willing to pile on enemies until things get downright nuts. Though the downside there is, performance is rough with so much going on. Then at 6, I have Cavit, which loses some points for being a straightforward Dig Dug clone, but gets some back for being a really good one. And in the end, quality trumps novelty in my books. After that, at 5, my pick is Bootscale, a fun little action puzzler where blocks are the weapon you and your enemies use to try to take each other out, making warfare one big real-time block puzzle game. And next, at 4, I've got Batlot, a shooter where instead of pushing blocks, you use them as cover, as you shoot down enemies and avoid their shots at you on the way to take out the enemy base. Then, getting into the best of the lot here, my number 3 is Ascend, a classic platformer design that's proof of just how much fun running and jumping on tiers of identical platforms can be, as you find your route to the top. And just barely beating out Ascend for me is Lyft, another platformer, but this time challenging you to use elevators and open shafts instead of ladders, while you collect every flag on the level. Then finally, my number 1 is Ariel, the game that started this whole review, where you fight air battles with planes and airships and cannons, making it one of the best scrolling shooter experiences on the TI-99. So that is a heck of a batch of new TI-99 gaming options that we got in 2022. From the least likely of places, too. Japan. Check out the description for the game files, as always, and keep in mind, these games do require the 32 game memory expansion. But what doesn't these days? This is Pixel Pedant, saying see you next time.